With us in studio today is Ben Freeth, human rights activist and a former Zimbabwean farmer. Together with his father-in-law, Mike Campbell, he took Robert Mugabe and the Zimbabwean government to court over the eviction notice that was eventually issued to them, despite the government's initial certificate of no interest in their farm. After they were defeated in the Supreme Court of Zimbabwe, Ben and his father-in-law took the case to the Southern African Development Community Tribunal, which eventually ruled in their favour. Mugabe's government, ignoring the ruling, withdrew Zimbabwe from the SADC, and Mugabe supporters finally invaded the farm and burned down the family's homes in 2009. Ben has been fighting to take back ownership of the farm since, with calls for expropriation without compensation becoming louder and stronger. We invited Ben to talk to us about his experiences and to ask his opinion about the South African land debate. Maybe to start, what are the consequences of a white person living in Zimbabwe taking Robert Mugabe to court?
Well, obviously you don't take on such a decision very lightly when you're up against a dictator who has committed genocide, who's killed thousands of people at his orders. So when we as a family made that decision, we thought about it and we prayed about it very hard, but we knew that we had to do it in the face of what was happening in our country, in the face of the absolute destruction that was taking place. We felt a compulsion to do whatever we could to stop the rot. And so I can remember, in fact, when my father-in-law actually signed his name on the court papers, and there was Robert Mugabe's name just above. I can remember there were tears that actually came to my eyes when he signed his name, because I knew what was coming to us. But we had taken the decision as a family that we had to stand against tyranny, that we had to stand against lawlessness, that we had to put an argument forward for doing things correctly, doing things right, and so we did do that, and yes, we lost in the Supreme Court of Zimbabwe. We knew that we would. All the judges that were sitting were people that had taken friends of ours' farms and things like that. So there was no chance of getting a fair hearing in the Supreme Court of Zimbabwe. But then it got to the Southern African Development Community Tribunal that was based in Windhoek in Namibia. And it was amazing. We got a fair hearing in that tribunal, and the tribunal eventually ruled in our favor. They said what was happening in Zimbabwe, the racial discrimination, was wrong. It must stop. They said that if they took farms, then compensation had to be paid. And they said that the change to the constitution that had taken place in Zimbabwe, where they could take land without any compensation, they could take land without us even having recourse to go to court about the fact that they were taking our land, taking our homes, taking our livelihood. They said that was against the SADC Treaty. So we were vindicated in the SADC Tribunal, and that was I remember it so well, the 28th of November 2008. It was one of the best days of my life, where we went to Namibia and we got that judgment from those 5 judges, and they ruled in our favor against Robert Mugabe. So that judgment will stand. It will continue to stand, even though it means very little at the moment in lawless Zimbabwe. It will eventually be a foundation stone on which the country can be rebuilt when we get a government that abides by the rule of law and wants to see the whole country go forward again.
And during this process, you were physically attacked and you almost died as a result thereof. What happened? How did it happen that evening, and what did they do to you?
Well, it was just before, in fact, it was just 2 weeks before the main hearing was due to take place in the SADC Tribunal. So we knew when they arrived that they were going to try and dissuade us from continuing with the case. And in fact, it was a Sunday. It was just a Sunday afternoon. My parents-in-law had just had lunch with us, and we got word that they were coming. This gang was coming for us. So unfortunately, the radio network on the farm wasn't working for some reason. I drove over to my parents-in-law's house on the other side of the farm, and I was greeted by guys with rifles leveled at my head, and I immediately obviously ducked beneath the windscreen of my car and put the car in reverse and tried to get out of there. And then the next thing, there was a rock that was smashed through my side window into my head, and we were dragged out. And then we were eventually taken to one of these torture camps. We were just going through that very bloody election that we had in 2008 at the time. And in fact, Mugabe had just been sworn, well, he was being sworn back into power that very afternoon, 29th of June 2008. And we were taken off to this torture camp, and it was night, and it was dark and cold, and we were stripped of most of our clothes, and we were tortured very terribly. And they eventually got my mother-in-law to sign a bit of paper because I was unconscious a lot of the time. I had a fractured skull and broken ribs and very severe bruising all over my body. And my father-in-law, they'd broken 7 bones in his body, and he was also unconscious. So they got my mother-in-law eventually to sign a bit of paper to say that we would withdraw from the SADC tribunal, we would withdraw from the court. But of course, you know, when it eventually came to, miraculously we survived that night, and miraculously we were able to be got to a hospital. When it came to the court in 2 weeks' time, there was no thought in any of our heads that we would withdraw. We believed that we had to carry on the road that we started. Unfortunately, my father-in-law deteriorated after that and eventually died. But my mother-in-law and myself survived, and we don't regret, and my father-in-law didn't regret in any way carrying on with that case, and he was alive to see that judgment, which he believed, and I believe today is a foundation stone for his grandchildren, for my children, for myself, to be able to rebuild our country.
So now in South Africa we have a lot of people talking about grabbing land, taking land without compensation, and we even have people going as far as saying that they are inspired by what has happened in Zimbabwe, and that it has to be done in South Africa as well, but maybe with a little bit less violence. What is your comment on that as someone who's experienced what happened in Zimbabwe, when you hear people in South Africa saying that that has to happen here as well?
Well, quite plainly, wherever nationalisation has taken place, because that effectively is what they're saying, is we want to nationalise the land. You know, it's happened through those Eastern Bloc countries in Russia and places in Eastern Europe. It happened in many countries to the north of us in Zimbabwe, where all the land was nationalised. And all it ended up with was hunger and poverty and a starving population that relied totally now on Western food aid. And that's where we've ended up in Zimbabwe, is every single year since the year 2000, when our farm invasions began, we've needed food aid to be poured in from the rest of the world to stop our people from starving. And that's a terrible situation for the people of our country to be in, where more than 25% of the population of Zimbabwe has actually been forced to leave the country, many of them with absolutely nothing, to try and find work in other countries so that they can be able to support their families, because there's over 90% unemployment rate in Zimbabwe as a result of this lawlessness, this complete nationalisation process that's taken place in our country. So to anyone in South Africa, they need to look at history. They need to look at what happens when governments decide they're going to nationalise private property. It just doesn't work. It creates poverty, it creates hunger, it creates a desperate population. it creates a failed state. And that's where we are today in Zimbabwe. And no one in South Africa, I'm quite sure, wants to have a failed state on their hands. But that's exactly what will happen. History, we can learn from history, or we can choose not to learn from history. And the likes of Julius Malema, if they deny history, eventually they will end up, I believe, on the wrong side of history.
Before we wrap up, do you believe South Africa is on its way to become the next Zimbabwe?
Well, I think for us in Zimbabwe, we believe that what happened to the north of us couldn't possibly happen within our own country. And I think a lot of South Africans probably believe the same here in South Africa. But what I'm saying is that what happened in Zimbabwe could take place in South Africa, and it will depend on South Africans as to whether it happens or not. And South Africans need to learn from history. They need to learn from what took place in Zimbabwe and understand that if they want a country for their children in the future, they have to stand up for what is right. They have to do what is right. They have to stand for the rule of law, stand for property rights. And that takes a lot of involvement. It takes a lot of community involvement. It takes supporting those leaders and those organizations that are batting on your behalf in South Africa. But I think South Africa is different. South Africa has got those organizations. South Africa has got a vibrant civil society that is doing its bit for the future of South Africa. And as people come together and people support each other and people work together to create that unity, to stand against lawlessness and stand against what's wrong, I believe that in South Africa you will stop the tide of lawlessness that has destroyed our country.
Ben Freeth, thank you very much. Thank you for coming in, and best of luck with all your ventures going forward.